Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Good to see you again, Arnie.
No worries.
It's
Pleased to
always
have
a
you.
high point in my week.
Always pleased to have you, Robert. Thank you for coming. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Oh, hi, Arnie. I hope you're well. We have pretty decent weather here now. We're getting deeper and deeper into spring.
Ah, beautiful, beautiful. Well, we're actually in Adelaide. We're due for rains next week. Some rains, the autumn rains that come. So yeah, it'd be nice. We've had, I mean, you can't complain. We haven't had a hot summer. We've had a relatively mild summer. The fruit production, the nuts, the honey in our area has been prolific. We've had a wonderful harvest, and so it's a busy time, of course, harvest time, because there's jarring to do and there's processing to do and all that cooking up and so we're a very busy household, but it really was a bumper season for us. That's probably not the right word. It was consistently good across all the crops. That would be the right word.
Hmm.
No bumpers in a sense of records, but all of them were good. And the summer was kind. And we put some, with the moon, we've actually planted some garlic out the other day. With the phases of the moon, we had a super moon. And it was fascinating because honestly, within 2 days, we had the garlic was shooting out of the ground. Within 2 days, it was incredible. Um,
Wow.
Hmm.
yeah, and interesting too, and I'll have to fess up on this. I've never planted garlic before, and I thought, well, garlic, it's got to be the pointy end down. That's where the first shoot comes out, and and my wife pulled me up, and we had a discussion on this, and I thought, no, no, you're wrong. It can't be. And she said, you come with me. And she said, let's go and have a look at a garlic. And we had it look, and sure enough, the pointy end goes up, not down. And so I was wrong. And I was thinking, well, there you go. And I was sure. I thought my logic has got to do it, but no, my logic was wrong. So beautiful woman, she was patient with me and all that. But it was a chuckle. So I'm fessed up. Do I know much about gardening? Not a lot, but we love it. We love our fruit trees. We love our bees. And my wife loves her garden, actually. She more than enjoys it. She
Hmm.
loves her garden, so it's beaut. All right, let's do a lap of the papers, and then we'll open the floor up. So first of all, the two major items I'm just looking at here for the Australian papers are actually the fact that Australia is going to be pulling out with the United States from Afghanistan in September. It's been a 20-year war, and we haven't achieved our goals. The Mujahideen, if you like, the Afghani, is going to reclaim his country, and he's going to actually get back to whoever's. It's a tribal system over there more than anything else. We're attempting to impose. We call it democracy, but in actual fact, it's not. It's a puppet government backed up by military might, and the Afghanis will get their country back September. There's also a lot of discussion in Australia about the alpha male because we're heading towards the Anzac Day celebrations. The 25th of April is Anzac Day. And traditionally, I say traditionally, try this one. The media will tear apart the alpha male around this time. And also, of course, the Remembrance Day in the 11th of November. The media generally does a hatchet job on the alpha male, and it's no different. There's been an investigation going on for 5 years now into supposed atrocities in Afghanistan by our elite servicemen. And this investigation, every 6 months, it seems to surface that it comes up with more atrocities, and there's still no charges laid, and our soldiers are fending off, I think is the right word, these accusations, and they need to. And of course, the media is getting deeper and deeper immersed in its attack on, in my view, the alpha male. And I read it every 6 months, and I write about it every 6 months, and it's no different this round of Anzac Day as it was last year with the Remembrance Day in November. Banking is important. banking is important in my view because of the Christine Holgate saga. She was Chief Executive Officer of Australia Post, a public utility. She was doing a brilliant job. It had previously been run down by previous boards, and she was actually turning it around, making it profitable. She was actually extracting payment from the banks for doing banking services, and also with parcel delivery and these things. And so she'd actually turned that utility around, and it was making profit. And I believe that it was because it was making profit that our government did a hatchet job on her last October. And of course, that hatchet job is still in the news. I think in the end, the big ticket about the Australia Post was that it had the potential of becoming a people's bank, a bank in its own right. And in my view, it's the very thing that the money power would have feared the most. I noted in Epoch Times that there's talk of actually adding an additional 4 judges to the United States Supreme Court. I've seen it happen. I've read of it happening in politics, where they've actually, in the upper house in Australia, they've flooded it with additional politicians in order to pursue a particular policy. And I know they've done it in Britain with the House of Lords. They've flooded the House of Lords, made a huge amount of extra peers in order to flood the House of Lords so that the lower house could actually achieve its policy. So no different. These are all tricks and shenanigans that are going on around us. But I do find it fascinating that the Democrats want to do it in the United States, and this is after the Supreme Court has turned a blind eye to the fraud that was carried on with the election, last November's election. I actually came across a video yesterday. It's not an easy video to actually depict, and it is to me the heart of, if you like, today's forum. And it was on the Gateway Pundit. I could actually find it. It was a young mum who was protecting her child from a drive-by gunman. She had been shot. In the end, it was mortal. It killed her. And she was putting her body on the line to protect her 1-year-old child. And I thought, you think about that, and you think about Easter, and you think about the saying, greater love hath no man or woman to lay down their life for their fellow man. And there was this young mum. And that really, I'm going to actually cut across to the final issue here, and it's by Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy, The Law of Love and the Law of Violence. And we have had 100 years of violence. We have had 100 years of pursuing. It's more than that. It actually goes back to the French Revolution. We've had this pursuit of world government. And of course, the French Revolution was the actually laying down the groundwork for it. Totalitarianism, class warfare, all these things were being fought over. And of course, the destruction of the aristocracy in France, but I also note in Russia, the destruction of the aristocracy. And I'm thinking in my mind's eye, the reason for having the aristocracy in any culture is that they are the custodians of the culture, and they should be fighting tooth and nail to hold on to that culture. In Australia, as in, I'm guessing, other nations, of which you blokes will have chance to respond to, but in Australia, our aristocracy is doing everything they can to destroy, discredit our culture, to actually denigrate it. And they do it generally through the media, but now they're doing it even to our children in grade school, in primary school. They're indoctrinating our children to hate our culture, to hate, if you like, manhood, to hate the alpha male, to apologise for being white and things like that. This is just straight indoctrination. In actual fact, Australia was a settled country. We didn't invade Australia. We came here and settled. And of course, the infrastructure and the development of the nation has happened across several hundred years of effort, of pursuit, of excellence, if you like. And what we did was Australia actually inherited the most stable form of law and government that the world has ever known. We actually have a more stable Trinitarian structure to government, to our judiciary, to actually our levels of government, we have a more stable Trinitarian perspective than even Britain with the Westminster system, because in Britain the House of Lords is emasculated. The House of Lords cannot withhold supply, whereas in Australia the upper house can withhold supply in all of our parliaments except for Queensland. Queensland dissolved their upper house. There were attempts to actually dissolve the upper house in New South Wales so that it became a unicameral instead of bicameral. So these things are very, very important. Constitutional evolution, history, things like that. Very, very important when we consider culture. So there was this young mum putting her body on the line to protect her child from a random drive-by shooting. And I thought, isn't that just a beautiful act of love, doing that? And of course, this to me is what Tolstoy is actually writing. The law of love and the law of violence. One or the other. How do you respond to this in this age, and especially with the capacity that we have for so much, if you like, logistical, military destruction? Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, the example of the young woman protecting her child is just normal, I think. And I imagine that most mothers would react in that way. Yeah, I have a personal thing I won't talk about. My son was murdered. And when I learned this, my great regret was that I wasn't there with him to be murdered as well. That's what I felt for months and months. Mm-hmm. A terrible thing. But that was my reaction to the news of what had happened to him.
Yeah.
Just to be with him, to face that. Anyway, I certainly agree with you about the aristocracy of our countries. Basically, the aristocracy now is a corporatocracy, isn't it? Corporatocracy. Mm-hmm. And all these corporations are lined up with the political correct agenda in a most astonishing way. You'd think there'd be some dissenters from it, but if there are, they're not getting any publicity. And I think they're all so intimidated that they're just going along. It's amazing what is this intimidation that can be applied to people in that way? So the CEOs of these companies all seem to be oriented in the same direction. It's quite extraordinary. It's true that we've had a century, more than violence. I mean, violence has marked our history for so long. I think there might have been a period. There was a period known as Merry England. I think that was relatively peaceful, but war has been just the common condition of mankind, it seems. It's extraordinary when there's a sustained period of peace. I'm not sure how. I think somebody has calculated the number of years that the United States hasn't been at war. It's very small. You could probably count it on the fingers of your hands from the time of the creation of the United States. They've been at war everywhere, all over the world. And so you'd wonder why this would be so. Is it because people are so hostile towards each other? I don't think that's the case, because these wars start and people are out massacring each other, and then a treaty is signed, and in a few years the people are on friendly terms. They might even be military allies. Look at Japan and Germany at war with the United States or the Allied powers, and now there are friendlies. So there was nothing inherently inimical between those populations. It was just something that was an artificial, temporary condition that was created. Now, I guess it's true that you can have ideas of superiority that lead to people, to countries being aggressive toward neighbors. That seemed to have happened in Japan and Germany. But even at that, you wonder what's the inspiration for the notions that their culture is superior and that it has a natural right to subordinate others. It just and then that just evaporates, and that propaganda has faded into the past. You know, there was a time in the First World War, in that early Christmas, when the soldiers came out at Christmas, they heard each other singing Christmas songs, and they were all singing the songs in different languages. Well, at least the French and the British and the Germans, I guess. And the soldiers, hearing each other singing, came out of the trenches and went and had parties together, and they played sports together. And the generals came over and said, "This is intolerable. Get back in your trenches." And the next day they were out bombarding each other again. So there's a lot of goodwill among ordinary people for other people. If you meet them, you find, generally speaking, that if you give them a smile, they'll be very kindly towards you. That's my experience anyway. So what is the reason for the militarization and the constant involvement in wars? Well, it's got to be largely economic, because war is a driver of economic development and economic production. And in the kind of economy we have now, where employment is an essential passport to having an income that enables you to survive, people will go along with endless preparation for war and endless advancement of war agendas, and even being inducted into militaries and being sent overseas. A lot of young people just have no future career evident to them. They're blocked. So they can get some advantages if they sign up for military duty, and this will end up sending them over to be involved in warfare if a war is started. And so the whole idea that the military is some great patriotic exercise, I think, is very wrong. People, generally speaking, get involved with it just because it is a source of income and a career path. And probably most of them hope that they won't have to go into some other country and get involved in killing their fellow men. I mean, you do that, and surely you're marked for life. You've got that history in your life, and at some point, you know, it's going to come crashing into your consciousness that you have been involved in this, and it turns out that the enemy was not so bad after all. They just wanted to be left in peace to their own devices often. You made some comments about the feminization of the military. I think this is conspicuously going on in all Western countries. It's certainly going on in Canada, our country. And I read recently an article that said that they're doing exactly the opposite in China. In China, they found that the young men are not macho enough. So they've got a deliberate campaign of masculinizing the population there. Well, if we're feminizing our military and they're masculinizing their military, that I think might bode ill for the future. I don't think it's a natural thing for women to be involved in fighting. This is not a politically correct view these days. Women are supposed to be the same as men. I don't think they are, and I certainly would prefer that they retained their feminine qualities and their maternal instincts, and they didn't get handed guns and go out into a conflict and be involved in all that brutality. It seems to be very inconsistent with normal femininity as far as I'm concerned. It's a perversion of the nature of femininity.
Okay, Wally Klinck, you've got the floor.
Well, I think, you have to look at the dynamics of human association. And you have to ask how humans are capable of interacting and why they interact in the way that they do. You would think that the appropriate type of action or interaction would be that which generates positive and constructive results for society. And it's a fact of life that we engage in physical activities and cultural activities and so on. And we do this for a purpose to achieve certain results. The results being an enhancement of the human situation. And so then why is it that we do respond in the way that we do? We're in a unique situation. If you look at nature, nature avails itself of the abundance of nature, and it goes on and persists and survives that way. Human beings do not. We have a strange rule that we can't do anything unless we act on a representation, an abstract representation of our resources. In other words, we have invented something that we call money. And money is the basis of virtually all of our major activities, our commercial activities, our productive activities. And somehow or another, we seem to have gotten sadly off track, because if our actual conditions coincided with the way they're represented by our financial system, everything should occur according to a natural process, or in the natural way. However, everything we do is conditional upon money in some way. So then we have to, I think we have honestly to ask the question as, does our abstract representation of reality actually harmonize with our financial representation of our activities? And I think that it is more than obvious that there is a great divide there, because our actual activities are so drastically influenced by our financial considerations. Because if you think of it, you don't do anything until you reach in your pocket or check your bank account or check your financial resources. If you have sufficient, you do things. If you don't, you don't. And that all affects the quality of our life. Now, the fact of the matter is that according to the social credit analysis, to Major Douglas's analysis and recommendations, we definitely are not. We have not devised a financial system which reflects the reality that lies behind our existence, our physical wealth, our actual creativity, ability to accomplish and to do things is all interfered with by the financial factor. And that does raise some very interesting questions. Under what circumstances did the financial system evolve or develop? Did it develop in the interests of people who have ulterior motives? Or did it develop just accidentally in our desperate attempt to devise a means of conducting commerce? I think that if you look at history, and you look at the financial history in particular, you will realize that financial affairs have been conducted according to our abstract conception of money. And I think it behoves us very, very much to look into the situation with a view of attempting to determine who has been behind the development of a financial system and whether or not they did have ulterior motives. We either have a situation that is consciously pursued for certain ends, which we do or do not understand, or we're simply blindly plowing ahead without really knowing what we're doing. And because human beings are beings of conscious intent, I think that is the more realistic approach. So it's an abstract situation. Abstractions seem to be difficult for human beings to really understand or to relate to realistic conditions. And we seem to be drifting at sea, either accidentally or at the guidance of people who find it beneficial to their own cause. And I think that unless we develop a conscious, knowledgeable base of understanding with regard to this anomaly, which seems to afflict humanity, we're not likely to get out of our difficulties, because a financial system that worked smoothly and effectively and realistically would coincide with our realistic objectives and resources. And we know that those resources are actually realistic. They're enormous.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Wally. That's beautifully put. I've managed to recover our desktop, so bear with me, ladies and gentlemen. I think important when Leo Tolstoy talks about the law of love and the law of violence, and we've seen several hundred years of it in these bloody revolutions, and of course the powers over and above government that can actually cause the government to actually, when I say change hands, I mean actually be directed towards certain individuals to actually lead. And I have no doubt in my mind's eye that the current administration is selected rather than elected. And I say that very carefully, selected, not elected. You go through if you like, the war on Iraq, and of course our historical documents in the archives are on target, and they highlight that there are ministers of the Crown overseas who are deliberately and specifically attributing responsibility for us falsely going into this war based on deceit to our parliament by the highest levels of government, the highest levels of administration. Deceit, downright lies to our parliament. And I think that's incredible. And we think, okay, someone has gone into Parliament and deliberately lied or deceived the Parliament in order to achieve a purpose, the purpose being initiating a new war action. Not actually a declaration of war, because if it is a declaration of war, it's actually treated differently in legal manner internationally. But if it's not a declaration of war, I might remind our viewers that Korea was a police action. Korea. This is the United States and the Allies in South Korea defending the line where communist China is coming from the north, and that was a police action. It was not a war. And if you look at the Vietnam, was it a declared war? Was Afghanistan or Iraq a declared war? It's not. It's actually a legal position that is taken so that certain circumstances can be, if you like, manipulated for their own ends. And so our military, in good faith, on the basis that they are doing the right thing, they are doing the alpha male thing of protecting the nation, the interests of the nation, our military are actually out there doing it, while the deceit is going on in the back rooms behind them. And of course it gets to the point where even the government doesn't know what's going on, because these decisions are made over and above government by, if you like, the money power. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Tony Blair is the perfect example. I don't know if his main name has been mentioned, but he's the fellow who came up with the, I don't know if he invented it, but he certainly promulgated the idea that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, and cities in the UK were 45 minutes away from destruction. And then you had this, at the time, highly respected general in the United States, Colin Powell, and he got up and he went through this litany of weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein supposedly was disposing of. And so there was a collaborative effort there to portray Iraq as a horrible threat to international peace, and the suggestion that Saddam Hussein was just itching to attack Britain and the United States. Could anything be more fantastic? It's insanity. But they put this out, and they got their militaries to form a coalition with other countries, lots of countries, I think, most of them contributing small numbers of soldiers, but I think even, countries like in Eastern Europe sent a contingent, and it gave a veneer of respectability to this military operation, but it was completely unjustified, because in the end it turned out that all these weapons of mass destruction were non-existent. So why did they do this? Previously, Saddam Hussein had been an ally practically of the United States. The United States supplied him with a lot of his military equipment, and even, I think, with some of these alleged biological or chemical warfare agents that he supposedly used. I think he did use them against the Iranis when they had the Iraq-Iran war. So suddenly he's gone from being an ally to being an enemy, and the United States is over there expending its vast accumulation of military equipment. Of course, they do this because they continually produce military equipment and airplanes and ships and tanks. So if they don't have it being consumed in a war somewhere, the people who are involved in all this productive activity will become redundant. So there's a tremendous pressure on a country like the United States, for example, where I understand that about 50% of the economy is related in some way to the military, which is in itself an extraordinary state of affairs. Well, there's a big impetus for them to continue involvement in wars and to start wars. And the United States has proven to be very adept at this. They've got wars going, and this war in Afghanistan, this backwater, has been going on for 20 years. It's accomplished absolutely nothing, in the same way that the war in Vietnam accomplished nothing. In fact, the wars nowadays end up with the superpower withdrawing and appearing as if they have lost the war, because they haven't achieved their ends, but they're leaving the country. So it's just a matter of keeping the consumption of all this war materiel going, and on it goes. It's an unending succession of wars. I think of George Orwell, especially with this Afghanistan war. He had the concept that in 1984, in the society of the time, there would be nonstop war, continuous war. And it would all be based on false propaganda and phony stories about great victories and the evilness of the enemy. And you'd have the world divided into 3 or 4 great divisions, and they would always constantly be at war with each other. Well, it seems as if we've almost reached that point. when you can have a thing like the war in Afghanistan go on practically indefinitely to no purpose whatsoever. It's achieved nothing. I think that around 260 Canadian soldiers have returned in coffins from that place. And as they were coming back, they were being paraded down a highway of heroes. Well, I was thinking, in the end, Afghanistan is going to be Afghanistan. And all these people are saying, we're introducing democracy to this country that knows no such thing. Well, there's no way Afghanistan is going to be what it is. It's always been a sort of tribal country, and it will have to evolve in its own way. You can't go in there and impose a completely novel administrative concept on a place like that. It has to develop on its own path. And certainly the outside world could assist them in positive ways, but it's not assisting them when it's going in there and blasting the place to pieces. If you look at photographs of Afghanistan going back, I don't know, 50 or 100 years, there was a tremendous civilization there. And there were beautiful architectural structures. And it's not preserved. It means nothing to these military people. They just want to go in and blow it all to smithereens. And they don't care if tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people die at the same time. So the populations of countries who care about creating a better world should really be concerned about getting this constant pressure for waste in the productive system relieved. And the pressure is the fact that people are not able to consume their normal productivity in their country. If they were able to do that, they would be content. If they were able to do that without having to get involved in extraneous productivity, and the perfect example of that is productivity for war purposes, then the ability of these warmongers to get their countries involved in these terrible exercises that have psychological consequences and physical consequences that are incalculable, it would just end. And there's no reason why people can't be using the resources of their country, trading for things that their country doesn't have conveniently with other countries that produce them more easily, and just getting along and not being in conflict all the time. The conflict is completely artificial. It's just an attempt to deal with a financial anomaly, that being that the way the accountancy in economies work, in any period, the population of a country cannot purchase its own production. And this creates a great pressure within the country to export. And what's better to export than bombs and airplanes and tanks? You know, things that will be sent away, blown to smithereens, so you can keep producing more of them. It's a madness. And the great tragedy is that people cannot see past the system that they are trapped in to demand a saner result from their efforts in the economic field.
Beautifully put, Robert. Thank you so much for that. It's an excellent summary of the futility of 20 years of American and, if you like, Australian-Canadian involvement in Afghanistan. And I remind our viewers, prior to that, it was 20 years of Russian campaigning through there. And both these superpowers have failed. That the Afghanis have actually held their ground. And come September, they will go back to the way things were. And do you blame them for actually holding on to their culture as they see fit? I mean, What sort of self-righteousness would actually insist that you have to live the way I live to another human being? Let that other human being live the way that they see fit. Now, I want to just touch on a couple of things before I give you the floor, Wally, and even if you're having trouble with Robert, the audio is working. So I'm going to cut across to our history of, if you like, I got drawn into Justin Raimondo as theantiwar.com. It was an excellent website for resources around the year 2000, and Justin, who's passed away since then, but his website is still continuing on. The legacy is not lost, and it appears to me that if Afghanistan is going to be wound down, already the US is talking about issues with Iran. So I would imagine that Iran is possibly on the radar. Now, going back to the year 2001, of course it was about oil, it was about geopolitics and the exertion of American influence, undoing, if you like, Iran, undoing Russia, and of course the Caspian Sea, exploitation of the Caspian Sea oil. They needed a corridor through Afghanistan, and that's what it was about. The corridor, the military went in to open up that corridor so that the Caspian Sea oil could be exploited. But I would imagine, I haven't chased it up recently, but I would imagine that actually has to have found a workaround, and they've got a viable workaround that no longer requires that corridor. So the vested interests who are attempting to exploit the Caspian Sea oil, who've had 20 years of war in Afghanistan, and of course I remind our viewers here that several hundred Canadians, 41 Australians, thousands of Americans, but 100,000 Afghani people have been butchered in their own nation through that invasion. How many? 100,000 Afghani people have been butchered to pursue policies that actually don't originate for the defence of a nation, but rather for the exploitation of the reserves that are prized, if you like, jewels that are pursued. Even for the likes of, say, it's openly admitted that the Brits went into South Africa because of diamonds and gold. They went into South Africa to seize those resources, and that's what the Boer War was about. I think there was two major campaigns there. And you realise that, of course, this history of they've got it, I want it. It's always fighting over something, but it's the innocent, if you like, it's the military people who are actually exploited, and of course the loss of life means nothing to these individuals who are pursuing these vast assets. It comes down to money. It comes down to it. So if we don't actually look to an answer, if we don't actually consider what Leo Tolstoy is saying, the law of love or the law of violence, we actually have a choice here. We are at a crossroads. We've got a potential for nuclear annihilation. We've got a potential for never-ending wars all around the world. All of this potential. But we also have the potential for great love. Great love towards our neighbour. Who is our neighbour? Anyone who is next to you. Who is your neighbour? Remember that story of the Good Samaritan? It was the religious leader who crossed the road at the other side rather than actually intervene. But it was the Samaritan, the despised Samaritan, who actually stopped and helped the man who had been robbed. He helped him, and he took him to a place where not to his own home, but to a place where he could be cared for and prepared to pay that cost. And that to me is if you like, what we need to consider. That the Samaritan was there, he was doing the right thing. The religious leader was full of humbug. And that's where we are with our self-righteousness, that we have a right to do these things, these campaigns. And I go back to the historical on targets, and in my view, I was scathing towards our then Prime Minister, who actually, his decision, insisted, I remember the media, I remember the interview, his decision alone as to whether they're going to actually execute this campaign, become involved in another war. And there it is, 20 years on. And if he could stand in judgment, and he should stand in judgment, as Tony Blair should, as the other leaders who actually drew us into these things of 20 years of violence against another nation. Some bloke was supposed to be Osama bin Laden, hidden in caves in in the deepest, darkest mountains of Afghanistan. What a load of crock. Your thoughts, please, Wally Klinck.
Well, yes, Arnie, it's a question of power and survival, and not only survival, but exploitation for private gain. And this is sort of the history of mankind. We've evolved in two senses. There are two parallel senses. There's the physical world into which we were born, and there is the financial world which parallels that and controls the actual physical existence of mankind through the mechanism of legalism, law, and the formal law, which is quite different than the law of love of which you speak. The law of love is something that you do intuitively and empathetically with a inexplicable but powerful affection, concern for your fellow man. And that is in the area of natural law, the way things really are. Human law is, let us face it, quite artificial, quite manipulated for private benefit, and a very poor substitute for natural law. When you approach other people with love, you behave constructively. You behave in a manner that is likely to produce satisfactory and pleasant results. But when you see, according to the social credit analysis, war is inevitable under the present financial system because there is a shortage of purchasing power. And if you don't have enough purchasing power, you cannot sell a product of industry and you cannot carry on in an economic sense. So we're forced to become involved not only in domestic economics, but in international economics. We somehow have to move the product to the consumer. And if you can't move the product to the consumer because you don't have enough effective buying power, you have to look for some source of that additional buying power. And it's absolutely essential that those things be sold, because it's upon their sale that the survival, success, and continuity of the business depends. And that relates to the security, the real security of humanity. So, and the thing of it is that when you have a pressure like that, where you're forced to export more than you import, and if you have to invade other nations to obtain the physical resources to help you to engage in this type of false, foul economic activity, it's bound to have adverse effects. It's just inevitable because it's not directed to human betterment. It's directed to a financial objective, which is really not necessarily related to the benefit of humanity. So we are really in a very difficult situation. It's not a difficult situation in reality because it would be very easy to correct if we simply altered the financial system to reflect the realities of production and consumption. But we insist on maintaining the same institutions which are increasingly ill-suited to the business of producing and consuming. And this creates a situation where we rely on the artificial means of drawing on the future in an abstract sense, in a financial sense, in order that we can carry on at present in a physical sense. But when you have a situation where you have to export more than you import, you are, I guess as Bob might say, beggaring your neighbor. And this causes all sorts of, inevitably causes all sorts of international conflict and resentment, hardship and resentment. And you have the seeds of war in the financial system in that sense. It is simply conducive of scarcity, artificial competition, identifying enemies where enemies do not exist, and literally creates a situation where humanity is driven, it would appear, on a path of eventual annihilation or self-destruction, all because we cannot see the reality for the trees, for the forest. We cannot see the reality that lies behind our lives because it is all distorted by a financial mirror or reflection. And this is a great tragedy. Major Douglas wrote an essay or delivered a talk called The Tragedy of Human Effort. And the trouble is, as we try to solve our problems of entirely financially induced scarcity, we devise more efficient physical means of producing things so that we can increase even further our production. But unfortunately, the way the financial system works, it becomes increasingly less representative of reality, less self-liquidating, less ability to liquidate its financial costs as you make the physical producing system more physically efficient and productive, so that we're in a situation where we're just being driven into a whirlpool. We're being drawn into a whirlpool of destruction. It is a tragedy of untold or unspeakable proportion. And it's all because we lack the knowledge and the will to make our accountancy system reflect the realities of our physical resources. Terrible, absolutely unthinkable, incomprehensible. And yet it is there to see.
Yeah, exactly right. Thank you so much for that, Wally. That's I'm aware that Robert isn't picking up your audio at the moment, and I don't think you are his. But it's vitally important for us to consider that the financial system is an abstract system. When we talk about the balance of payments or exports against imports and things like that, they're actually only theorizing things in our mind. But the reality is the goods that are produced. There they are, they're produced. All this commodities, the raw materials, the energy, the effort, the design, the technology has gone in to produce the goods. And yet we can't actually purchase them. We aren't capable of purchasing them because the financial system is tied in with the economic system, but it actually stops the economic system from being distributed. And that's the anomaly within the financial system. We need to address this because in the end, all these roads of conflict, of challenging, of going for markets, if you like, of forcing our will on other nations, all these things come down to a fraudulent and abstract financial system. And wars are used deliberately to bring about more power. Now, if you consider the First World War specifically was to destroy certain empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Turkish Empire. These were deliberate destruction of these. And of course in the Middle East, I think it was Iran, there was a strong empire there as well. The First World War and the Second World War, why did Hitler come to power? I mean, honestly, why? The Treaty of Versailles had impoverished the German people. They were looking for a saviour. They should have actually looked within themselves, and unfortunately, of course, their hands were already tied. Financially and economically, their hands were tied because they were under, if you like, a military dictatorship. It was the seeds were placed there, and of course the selection of Adolf Hitler as their leader, the selection, not election, the selection of him being the very type of person who would pursue a policy of expansion, of expanding markets in order to resolve discrepancies within the financial system in their own nation. That's what it's about. That's a reflection of it. And you look at what's going on with America colonizing this one and that one, the threats that China is directing towards Taiwan and Hong Kong are all about resolving their balance of payments, their exertion of pressure and power. We've got to find a better way. The law of love, the law of violence. We've got to find a better way. Otherwise, all we're going to do is head towards the end of this civilization, because we don't have the political will, the resolve, to actually take into account our own personal responsibility of participating in the crisis that we find ourselves in. We have to accept responsibility. We have to participate. We have to learn. We have to study. We have to stop looking at the box and start thinking, because the answers are there. But until the political will is there, not only to uncover the answers, but to pursue them, pursue the answers through government. We have the tools. Representative government is there. Don't tell me we can't get control of it again. We can get control of it. Historically, people didn't have the institutions. They didn't have the, if you like, the infrastructure of the courts, of the parliaments. They didn't have that. And yet they still found a way to exert influence and power over their government. And there it was, if you like, going back to the history 1100s, the Coronation Charter, which evolved into Magna Carta. And even the Magna Carta continued to evolve for another 400 years after that. It wasn't a in stone, these are the 10 rules, that's the end of it document. It was actually an evolution. And so is this thing called constitutionalism. It's actually evolving. And the question is whether we have the heart and the soul within ourselves to pursue it, to accept personal responsibility, the calling that is on your life as is on my life, to actually bring about a better place, a better world, where the law of love permeates over what we're seeing as the law of violence. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, I would just say that military war we have vast experience of. But now we're involved with another war because of this COVID business. And this is very reminiscent. It has echoes of the military war. They even use military terminology for it. They talk about healthcare workers being frontline soldiers, practically. They're always on the front line. And we have seen the most unbelievable expansion of government debt, exactly as we've seen it in any all-out war that a government has been involved in the past. There is no limit to the amount of money that will be expended on this alleged attempt to save humanity from this dubious virus. They're talking in the UK of having a system of testing that will be applied to the entire population, I think, on a weekly basis. I might be getting that wrong. It might be a monthly basis. But anyway, the budget for this is anticipated to equal the entire budget of the National Health Service. So what is going on here? It's just mind-boggling that they're able to pursue these policies and ignore completely the interests of the population. They are going to indebt the public in exactly the same way as they were managing to do it through the wars of the past, the First World War, the Second World War, all these subsidiary wars. They leave a trail of debt that the public is responsible for. Well, who benefits from this? I'm sorry to say, It's the financial community, particularly the international financial community. And if you look at their activities, the same people end up financing opposite sides in these military conflicts. It's astonishing. But since they also control the writing of history, not much attention is drawn to this anomalous situation. So we're presented with just an endless succession of crises and wars, and this final one is turning out to be a war upon the population of every country. They're trying to subdue every national group, in fact, to abolish national groups and to subordinate individuals, cancel the very concept of freedom. Virtually all of our freedoms have been erased on the pretext of fighting this COVID thing. And we're going to be enslaved to a debt load that was inconceivable a year ago. Who would have thought that they'd be borrowing money like this? And so the policy of getting people into impossible debt loads through the dealing with crises, and in the past, the most notable of these have been military crises, but now they've taken it a step further. And if you listen to what is being said about this COVID business, there is no intention of ending it. They're anticipating more variants and different viruses in the future pandemics. This is what the politicians and the people with financial power who seem to be controlling them, just as if they've got all their ducks in a row. There's no dissent. There's no alternative view presented. All the politicians have said, well, we just have to shut the economy down and dispossess all the small businessmen and throw millions of people into unemployment. I mean, unemployment, they're providing some financial support, but they've warned that this is a temporary expedient. So just worse times ahead because of all this. And it is so anomalous. It makes no sense. We're living in a time of such abundant productive capacity. There is no reason for anybody to be threatened with not having a home and not having the economic means, the financial means to live a decent life. So we've just not taken control of our institutions in a way that will enable us to benefit from this fantastic heritage we have. It should be our inheritance. Well, unfortunately, the concept of inheritance is going out the window. And now we're being told by Klaus Schwab, I don't know where the heck he came from, but out of the shadows to tell us what the future will be. And he says, in the future, you will own nothing and you will be happy. And he's saying you will own nothing because I and my friends are going to own everything on the planet. This is intolerable, and it has to be challenged and stopped.
Yeah, excellent summary. Klaus Schwab owning everything, and the rest of humanity, 9,000 million people, owning nothing under the COVID tyranny. And that's what it is. It's a tyranny. It's actually a seizure of the assets of the entire world. And our politicians, instead of doing something about it and protecting us from it, they're complicit. They're actually in the middle of it. And this is the truth of the situation. It comes back to the individual accepting responsibility and attempting to regain control of their government. So yes, we are where we are. Leo Tolstoy has given us a heads up when he wrote that, the law of love, the law of violence. He has given us a heads up. He's given us an opportunity to consider at this point of crossroads in the history of the world. Are we going to take the right road, or are we just going to, like flotsam, just be tossed around like the waves and do nothing, just accept our bowl of pottage, because that's what it will be, is a bowl of pottage, instead of having the resolve to enter into a kingdom of abundance, a kingdom of plenty. And this issue goes back hundreds of years, it goes back thousands of years. It's always been there, of if you like, an elite who wish to rule the world, the known world. It's always been there, and it's no different in our day. We're fortunate because we had Douglas 100 years ago writing about this with his work. The Economic Democracy was the first work, and then I think the second was Credit Power and Democracy was the second work. So it's 100 years when these writings were first released into the public. He saw it then because he was an engineer designing infrastructure projects like the London Tube. I think it was the Mail Tube that he was involved in, and also significant projects on the in India and elsewhere for vast industrial concerns. And he saw it. He saw automation coming. He was one of the first to use a tabulating machine, which is the forerunner to computing. So he saw it. He saw the mechanized age coming. He witnessed it firsthand, and he recognized that if all this energy is being put into the area of production, then the anomaly within the financial system will be even more exacerbated, and that is that even less in wages will be distributed. And so this anomaly has never been addressed. For the last 100 years, it hasn't been addressed. And we're sitting on this, doing nothing, oblivious to a tidal wave of tyranny coming our way. So closing comments and summary, please.
Well, yes, Arnie, it's an amazing thing. You know, we have the potential for a grand life, and there are people who seem to want to destroy it. They're just wanting to destroy it on the belief or pretext of a belief that we are essentially each other's enemy, that there is exploitation going on in a world of actual plenty, and that these revolutionary elements want to destroy the basis, the considerable basis of culture and economy and so on that we have built or accumulated as a heritage. And they are saying, basically, I think, that property is evil. Property is not evil. If you don't have property, you can't produce. And if you have no control over the property that you have, and it's all in the hands of incompetence within the state, it's going to come to no good end. So you see, when property produces wealth, the producer has to get rid of that wealth because it's the basis of his continuation. And we can choose to do it by the increasingly inadequate money that the producer, through no fault of his own, just because of accountancy factors, the inadequacy of income to the consumers that he or she pays. And that is what is causing the problem. We simply don't have an effective means of distributing the real wealth that we produce, except that we have, in a sense, dealt with the problem by the instrumentality of debt. But debt cannot be accounted as genuine purchasing power. It's only an artifice, a temporary measure, which has in the future to be accounted for. It's not something you can just say, well, I guess I'll just forget about the debt. You can't do that because those who hold the debt demand that it be settled. The banking institutions primarily, or some of those institutions which are tied closely to the banking system. So we have dealt with it, but we've dealt with it in a false manner and in a manner that where the chickens come home to roost. Now, you see, the government is now saying, oh, well, if you're having trouble as small producers, we'll come to your rescue. We will actually pay your debts. However, condition is that you must sacrifice, you must hand over your physical assets to the state, and the state will administer them. Well, we know what happens when the state tries to administer production. The state is a mere abstraction, and the people who run it are not experts in given fields. They tend to be ideologues who have some kind of a vague notion, unsound notion as to how things should be produced and how they should be distributed. And they usually end up making a complete mess out of everything because they don't have the long expertise that the genuine producer accumulates over time. So there is a very, very real place for productive property, and without it, we will simply have a recession of living standard that goes back and back and back and diminishes. The supply chains will shrink, the quality will diminish, and we will be driven back to a lower and lower standard of life. And that's what you'll get from this idea that really comes from a mistaken notion that other people are deliberately trying to exploit everyone else. It's not, they have no alternative, really. They have, in order to continue on providing goods and services, they have to engage in antisocial exploitative means in order to secure the markets. They need to balance their costs with effective means of liquidation through incomes paid to them by consumers. And so you see, we're just in a completely difficult situation, an impossible situation. It's the position that we've driven ourselves into merely by false accountancy and false notions about the origins of wealth and the justification for participating in wealth. If we don't have the means to participate in wealth, to access wealth, we can't support the producer. And you know what that means. The producer will go out of business and your standard of living will simply diminish. And that's where your jealousy, your envy, from which this idea of exploitation derives. And it's very negative, a very negative and a very destructive attitude, a very unchristian, a very unloving position. And it's just leading down a spiral of ruination. So this is the position we're in, and the distressing thing about it is that it was so very easy to resolve. All we have to do is recognize our assets properly, recognize them for what they are, and make sure that they are able to function, and that the consumers are able to derive the benefit of that function. And it's all financial. It's all in an abstract financial world that we're attempting to deal with these problems. And it simply means a change of attitude, of morals, and of accountancy principles. So you see, our problems are of our own making, or the making of those who control the financial system. And they're very easily resolved. As easily resolved as we have seen production problems be resolved in the past. When credit flows like water, the productive system responds in a most amazing manner. Not only as it was prior to First World War I, when there was such an outburst of economic activity, but in the negative sense, in the wars of destruction and waste that we've been able to, conduct, when some people were saying we couldn't afford to have a war. Well, when the money flowed, we afforded the physical means of war very, very, very easily. I know my uncle told me that no time. I asked him, did you ever have a time when you was fighting people? Did you have a time when you couldn't access the means to carry out that function? He said, not really. He said, the physical goods, the armaments flowed. So you see, it can be done, but it was done for the wrong purpose.
Exactly right. Done for the wrong purpose. So war is actually a policy and economic, and if you like, an economic challenge by other means. It's a pursuit of policy by other means. Very good. A very good forum today, gentlemen. We've had a good run, and I really appreciate your contribution. War, what is it good for? Thank you so much. This is Arnis Luks at the Crossroads.
Thank you, Arnie. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you and to discuss these terribly critical matters.
No worries. Cheers.